The faded postmark on the letter had been her beacon of hope. But as Harriet Porter stood before the dilapidated cabin with her trunk at her feet and the Colorado sun beating down on her bonnet, that hope withered like spring flowers in August heat. This was not the modest but comfortable homestead promised in the letters from her soon-to-be husband. The year was 1875, and Golden, Colorado was supposed to be her fresh start, a place where the painful memories of her family's financial ruin in Philadelphia could be left behind. At 22, Harriet had few prospects back east after her father's investments collapsed, taking their social standing with them. When she'd seen the advertisement seeking a bride for a successful rancher with prospects, it had seemed like Providence. "Hello," she called out, her voice carrying across the barren yard. No answer came but the whisper of wind through tall grass. The small cabin before her had a sagging porch, a door hanging askew on rusted hinges, and windows clouded with years of dust and neglect. Harriet gathered her courage and stepped onto the porch, wincing as the boards creaked ominously beneath her weight. Through the grimy window, she could see an interior as abandoned as the exterior suggested, a single room with nothing but an old table, a rusted stove, and a narrow cot with no bedding. "Mr. Kincaid," she called again, pushing the door open with trembling fingers. The hinges protested loudly, announcing her entrance to a home that clearly hadn't witnessed a human presence in months, perhaps years. A sob caught in her throat as she surveyed what was meant to be her new life. Howard Kincaid's letters had painted a different picture entirely: a thriving ranch, a cozy home awaiting only a woman's touch, and a hard-working man eager to welcome a wife. The reality before her spoke only of deception or disaster. Harriet lowered herself onto the single wooden chair, which wobbled precariously beneath her. Her trunk remained outside, too heavy for her to drag inside alone. She had exactly $3.42 to her name, enough for perhaps a night at a hotel and a meal, but not enough to return east, even if she could bear the humiliation. The sound of approaching hoofbeats snapped her from her despair. Harriet hurried to the door, uncertain whether to hope for rescue or fear further trouble. A tall man on horseback approached, his broad shoulders and weathered cowboy hat silhouetted against the setting sun. "Miss Porter." The man's voice carried across the yard as he dismounted in a fluid motion that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. "Good Lord, you're already here." His face, partially obscured by a week's growth of beard, reflected obvious distress. "Mr. Kincaid?" Harriet asked, her voice smaller than she'd intended. The man removed his hat, revealing sandy hair and troubled hazel eyes. "Howard Kincaid, madam, I." He looked at the cabin and then back at her, genuine anguish crossing his features. "I can explain, though I'm not sure any explanation will suffice." Harriet felt anger rising to replace her shock. "You described a ranch house with 3 rooms, Mr. Kincaid. You wrote of chickens and cattle and fields of hay." She gestured at the decrepit cabin. "This is hardly what I agreed to when I boarded that train." Howard's shoulders slumped. "You're right to be angry, Miss Porter. The truth is—" He paused, seemingly gathering courage. "The letters I sent were honest when I wrote them. This was just a temporary shelter while I built the main house. I had 40 head of cattle, good grazing land and timber cut for building." "And now," Harriet prompted, noting the past tense, "3 months ago, while I was away in Denver securing supplies, rustlers hit my ranch. They took the cattle, burned my barn with the timber inside, and shot my ranch hand." His voice was flat, recounting facts too painful for emotion. "By the time I returned, there wasn't much left. I sent a letter to you immediately, but—" He trailed off. "I received no such letter," Harriet said, her indignation wavering slightly. I feared as much, Howard sighed. The mail service is unreliable at best. I've been working dawn to dusk at the Murphy mine to earn enough to rebuild before you arrived, but I miscalculated your travel time. He met her eyes directly. I have a room arranged for you in town, at the widow Bradley's boarding house. I wouldn't expect any woman to stay here. Harriet studied him, searching for deceit but finding only exhaustion and sincere regret. And what am I to do in Golden, Mr. Kincaid, while you rebuild what was promised? I have no funds, no connections here. Mrs. Bradley needs help with her boarding house. She's agreed to give you room and board plus a small wage in exchange for your assistance. He hesitated. I'd understand if you'd rather return east. I can arrange passage, though it might take a few weeks to gather the funds. Harriet considered her options. Return to Philadelphia in disgrace. Stay in a strange town working as a glorified maid while waiting for a man she'd never met before today to rebuild the life he'd promised her. The mining company pays on Friday, Howard continued, shifting uncomfortably under her scrutiny. I can give you half my wages then. It's not much, but it would get you started if you choose to leave. The sincerity in his voice gave her pause. He hadn't abandoned her or tried to force her to stay in the squalid cabin. He'd made arrangements for her comfort, even in his reduced circumstances. I'll stay at Mrs. Bradley's for now, she said finally, but I make no promises beyond that, Mr. Kincaid. Relief flooded his features. That's more than I deserve, Miss Porter. Let me help with your trunk. As he lifted her heavy trunk onto his horse with surprising ease, Harriet noticed the calluses on his hands and the way his shirt stretched across shoulders broadened by hard labor. His letters had described him as 30 years old, and up close, she could see the weathering of his face matched that description. Old enough to have established himself, young enough for a fresh start. It's a mile to town, he said, offering his arm to help her mount. You can ride and I'll walk alongside. Harriet shook her head. I'll walk with you, Mr. Kincaid. I've been sitting on trains and stage coaches for days. Besides, she added with surprising boldness, I'd like to hear more about these grand plans of yours that have now fallen to ruin. A smile briefly transformed his solemn face. It wasn't all fiction, Miss Porter. This land can be something special with enough work and a bit of luck. As they walked the dirt road toward Golden, Howard pointed out features of the landscape invisible to her untrained eye, where the best grazing lay, where a spring provided clean water even in drought, where he'd planned to build the proper house. It was to be 2 stories, he explained, animation entering his voice for the first time. 3 bedrooms upstairs for a family, a proper kitchen and parlor below. I'd already cut most of the timber and had the foundation stones quarried. You sound as if you still believe it possible, Harriet observed. Howard's expression grew determined. I do. It'll take longer now, but this setback isn't the end. Colorado's still growing, and there's opportunity here for those willing to work for it. Harriet considered this. In Philadelphia, her father's failure had been terminal to their prospects. The unforgiving social hierarchy permitted no redemption for financial ruin. Here in this raw territory, perhaps second chances truly existed. There's Golden, Howard said, pointing to lights appearing ahead as dusk settled over the valley. The town was smaller than Harriet had imagined, but more established than she'd feared. Solid brick buildings lined the main street, with wooden structures branching off on side roads. A church spire rose against the darkening sky, and lamplight glowed from shop windows. The mountains looming beyond the town provided a dramatic backdrop that even Philadelphia's finest parks couldn't rival. Mrs. Bradley's boarding house proved to be a tidy 2-story home on a quiet side street. The widow herself, a brisk, gray-haired woman of perhaps 50, answered Howard's knock. "So you've arrived at last," she said, eyeing Harriet with frank curiosity. "Howard explained your predicament. I've prepared the blue room for you." "Thank you, Mrs. Bradley," Harriet replied, striving for dignity despite her dusty traveling clothes and obvious fatigue. "Mr. Kincaid tells me you might have work for me as well." "Indeed. I've more boarders than I can manage alone since the new smelter opened." "We'll discuss details in the morning after you've rested." Mrs. Bradley stepped aside to let them enter. "You can bring the lady's trunk upstairs, Howard, then be on your way. It's not proper for you to linger." Howard nodded, carrying Harriet's trunk up the narrow staircase with ease. At the door to a small but clean bedroom, he set it down and turned to her. "I'll come by on Friday evening with whatever I can spare," he said quietly. "Again, I'm truly sorry, Miss Porter." Harriet found herself touched by the genuine remorse in his eyes. "Friday, then." "Good night, Mr. Kincaid." After he departed, Harriet sat on the edge of the narrow bed, finally alone with her thoughts. She had gambled everything on the promise of a new life and lost spectacularly. Yet something about Howard Kincaid's determination sparked a reluctant admiration. He hadn't whined about his misfortune or abandoned his responsibilities. He'd faced her directly and offered what solutions he could. Philadelphia society would consider her ruined now, an unmarried woman in a frontier town with no chaperone and no position. But perhaps Colorado operated by different rules. As she unpacked her meager belongings, Harriet resolved to approach this unexpected situation as an opportunity rather than a disaster. The next morning brought clarity and routine. Mrs. Bradley explained that Harriet's duties would include helping prepare breakfast and dinner for the 8 boarders, maintaining the common areas, and assisting with laundry. In exchange, she would receive room, board, and $2 weekly, a fair arrangement given Harriet's circumstances. The boarders themselves were primarily young men working at the smelter or in the mines, with one elderly schoolteacher and a middle-aged clerk from the assayer's office completing the household. They treated Harriet with polite disinterest, too tired from their labors to pay much attention to the new help. By Friday, Harriet had settled into a routine that, while demanding, allowed her time to explore Golden and consider her options. The town was growing, with new businesses opening and houses being built. There was opportunity here, though not the sort she'd been raised to recognize. Howard arrived promptly at 7 that evening, his appearance transformed by a clean shave, fresh shirt, and newly brushed hat. He waited in the parlor while Mrs. Bradley fetched Harriet. "You look well," he said, standing as she entered. "Is Mrs. Bradley treating you fairly?" "Quite fairly," Harriet confirmed. "The work is honest, if not what I expected to be doing in Colorado." Howard nodded, then reached into his pocket and extracted a small cloth pouch. "It's $15, half my week's wages as promised." Harriet stared at the pouch, surprised by the amount. "The mine pays well." "It's dangerous work," Howard replied simply. "They compensate accordingly." She hesitated before accepting the pouch. "I don't feel right taking your money. It's the honorable thing to do given the circumstances." His jaw tightened. "I've arranged with Mr. Davis at the Mercantile to extend you credit if you need anything. He'll bill me monthly." The gesture touched Harriet more than the money. "That's very thoughtful." Howard cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I was wondering if you might permit me to show you more of the area tomorrow. It's my day off, and I'd like you to see what I described in my letters, what's still possible, despite current setbacks." Harriet considered the invitation. Propriety dictated she decline an unchaperoned outing with a man who was, legally speaking, neither her husband nor even properly her fiancé. Yet she was curious about the land he'd spoken of so passionately, and her position was already so unorthodox that conventional rules seemed absurd. I would like that, she decided. Mrs. Bradley has given me Saturday afternoons free. Relief crossed Howard's features. I'll come at noon with the wagon. True to his word, Howard appeared the following day with a borrowed wagon and team. Mrs. Bradley watched from the porch with disapproving eyes as Harriet climbed aboard, but she made no comment beyond a reminder to return before dark. She doesn't approve of me, Howard observed as they pulled away. Harriet smoothed her skirts. She doesn't approve of the situation. There's a difference. Is there? He glanced at her with unexpected sharpness. Most folks in town believe I intentionally misled you, brought an innocent Eastern girl out here under false pretenses. And did you? Harriet challenged. No. His hands tightened on the reins. Every word I wrote was true at the time. I'd worked 5 years to build what I had. Losing it all wasn't part of my plan. Harriet softened. I believe you, Mr. Kincaid. They rode in silence for a while, following the same road they'd walked that first evening but continuing beyond where the cabin stood. The landscape opened up into a beautiful valley with Clear Creek winding through it, the mountains rising majestically beyond. Howard pulled the wagon to a stop on a gentle rise overlooking the valley. This is where I plan to build the main house, he said. The view changes with the seasons, but it's never less than breathtaking. Harriet had to agree. Even Philadelphia's finest homes couldn't boast such a vista. The autumn colors were just beginning to touch the aspen groves dotting the higher elevations, and the creek sparkled in the midday sun. How much land do you own? She asked. 160 acres, a proper homestead claim. Pride tinged his voice. I've proved up on it, fully dug irrigation ditches, fenced 40 acres, built the cabin. It's mine, free and clear now. Harriet tried to imagine the vast expanse transformed into a working ranch. And you truly believe you can rebuild? Howard nodded, his expression resolute. I've spoken with the bank about a loan using the land as collateral. They're reluctant, but the mine foreman has vouched for my character and work ethic. If I continue at the mine through winter, I should have enough saved by spring to make a start, loan or no. He pointed toward the eastern edge of the property. The rustlers didn't find my 2 best breeding heifers. I'd hidden them in that box canyon when I heard rumors of trouble. It's not much, but it's a beginning for a new herd. His determination was infectious. Harriet found herself studying the land with new eyes, seeing not what was lost but what might yet be. Where would the garden be? She asked. Surprise and pleasure flickered across Howard's face at her interest. Here, protected from the winds but with good southern exposure. He gestured to an area near where the wagon stood. And the barn would stand there, with corrals extending to the creek for easy water access. For the next hour, he walked her around the property, painting a vivid picture of his plans. Harriet found herself caught up in his vision despite her reservations. When they reached the old cabin, Howard fell silent, his enthusiasm dampened by the stark reminder of present reality. I'll understand if you decide to return east, he said abruptly. This isn't what you agreed to, and I've no right to hold you to our arrangement. Harriet studied him in the golden afternoon light. There was an integrity to Howard Kincaid that she respected, a straightforward honesty rare in her experience. I haven't decided yet, she replied truthfully. But I'm not ready to surrender so quickly. Philadelphia holds nothing for me now. Hope brightened his eyes. Does that mean you're considering staying, even with everything? I'm considering it, she confirmed, but I'll need some time. Of course. He nodded, careful not to press his advantage. Meanwhile, I have something to show you." Howard led her to the back of the cabin where, to her surprise, a small patch of ground had been recently cleared and cultivated. Hardy vegetables, turnips, carrots, and cabbages grew in neat rows. "I planted these after the raid," he explained. "They're yours if you want them. Mrs. Bradley might let you use her kitchen to put some by for winter." The simple gesture, practical yet thoughtful, moved Harriet unexpectedly. This wasn't the romantic courtship she'd imagined, but there was something profoundly human in the offering of food grown from devastated land. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'd be glad to have them." As they harvested the vegetables together, Harriet found herself sharing stories of her life in Philadelphia, the music lessons and literary societies, the elaborate social rituals that had seemed so important until her father's financial collapse. Howard listened attentively, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. In turn, he told her of his journey west from Kentucky at 19, the years of working on others' ranches until he saved enough to stake his own claim, the solitude of winters and the satisfaction of building something from nothing. "It's not an easy life," he admitted as they loaded the vegetables into the wagon, "but it's a good one when things go right." On the ride back to town, Harriet noticed how Howard's shoulders seemed less burdened than when they'd set out. Sharing his vision had rekindled his own faith in it, she realized. "I'll call on you next Saturday if I may," he said as they reached Mrs. Bradley's. "Perhaps we could attend church together, then dinner afterward." Harriet appreciated the conventional nature of the invitation, a public outing that would help normalize their unusual situation in the eyes of the town. "I'd like that," she agreed. True to his word, Howard arrived the following Saturday morning looking remarkably transformed. He'd purchased a new shirt and string tie, and his usually wind-blown hair was neatly combed. The effect was striking. Beneath the rough exterior of the working rancher was a handsome man with intelligent eyes and a warm smile. Church service provided Harriet her first real introduction to Golden society. She felt curious glances throughout the service, but Howard's attentive presence beside her and Mrs. Bradley's grudging chaperonage lent her an air of respectability. After the service, several women approached to introduce themselves, their initial reserve melting when they realized Harriet possessed both education and proper manners. "You must join our Ladies' Aid Society," insisted Mrs. Gardner, the doctor's wife. "We meet Wednesdays to sew for the orphanage in Denver. And the literary circle meets monthly," added Miss Wilson, the town's librarian. "We're reading Dickens this winter." Harriet accepted both invitations gratefully, recognizing the social lifelines being extended. When Howard escorted her to dinner at the hotel afterward, she felt a new sense of possibility. Golden might be smaller than Philadelphia, but it wasn't the cultural wasteland she'd feared. The hotel dining room represented the pinnacle of local refinement, with white tablecloths and a menu featuring imported delicacies, alongside local fare. Harriet could see Howard calculating costs as he studied the menu, and she tactfully suggested the roast chicken rather than the more expensive beefsteak. "I'm sorry I can't offer more," he said quietly after the waiter departed. "In time, I hope to do better." "This is lovely," Harriet assured him. "Besides, it's the company that matters, not the setting." Howard's expression lightened. "You're being very gracious about all this, Miss Porter." "Harriet," she corrected impulsively. "If we're to know each other better, perhaps we can dispense with formalities when we're alone." "Harriet," he repeated, seeming to savor the name. "Then you must call me Howard." Their conversation flowed more easily after this small intimacy. Howard spoke of his plans to take on additional shifts at the mine, and Harriet shared her growing comfort with life at the boarding house. By the time dessert arrived, a shared slice of apple pie, they were laughing together over the eccentricities of Mrs. Bradley's boarders. As autumn progressed into early winter, their Saturday outings became a pleasant routine. Sometimes they rode out to the homestead, where Howard worked steadily during his free hours to repair the cabin and clear new fields. Other times they explored Golden, attending socials at the church or concerts at the town hall. Harriet found herself increasingly involved in community life. The Ladies' Aid Society welcomed her needlework skills, and her suggestions for improving the efficiency of their production were received with appreciation. At the literary circle, her education made her a valued contributor to discussions. Mrs. Bradley, noting Harriet's competent management of the boarding house, increased her wages and delegated more responsibilities. Through it all, Howard's steady presence anchored her adjustment to frontier life. Though he worked punishing hours at the mine, he never failed to check on her welfare or bring small gifts, a book from the mercantile, wildflowers gathered on his way to town, a length of ribbon he thought matched her eyes. When heavy snow fell in late November, he appeared with a pair of sturdy winter boots he'd ordered from Denver, insisting they were a practical necessity rather than a luxury. Yet despite their growing friendship, neither mentioned the marriage that had been the original purpose of Harriet's journey west. The disruption of Howard's circumstances had created an unspoken agreement to postpone such considerations until his situation improved. December brought bitterly cold weather and new challenges. Two of Mrs. Bradley's boarders departed for warmer climates, reducing the household income. The mine reduced shifts due to transportation difficulties in the snow, cutting into Howard's earnings. On the Saturday before Christmas, he arrived looking more careworn than usual. "I can't take you to dinner today," he apologized. "The mines delayed wages until after New Year's because of the railway disruptions." "Then we'll walk instead," Harriet suggested practically. "I've packed some bread and cheese." They strolled through town, admiring the festive decorations in shop windows. The mercantile displayed toys and candies. The hotel had erected a magnificent tree in its lobby, and even the saloon sported a wreath on its door. "What were Christmases like for you in Philadelphia?" Howard asked as they found a sheltered bench in the small town park. Harriet's mind filled with memories of elaborate parties, mountains of gifts, and formal dinners with imported delicacies. "Very different from here," she admitted. "My father believed in celebrating lavishly. Looking back, perhaps that was part of our downfall, the constant need to impress others." Howard nodded thoughtfully. "My family kept Christmas simply. My mother would save all year to ensure each child had one special gift, plus something practical. The church service and singing carols together afterward meant more than the presents." "That sounds lovely," Harriet said, surprised to find she meant it. "What about here? How does Golden celebrate?" "There's a community dinner at the church on Christmas Day for those without family nearby. And the miners who stay in town usually have a rather rowdy celebration at the saloon." He smiled apologetically. "Not very refined, I'm afraid." "Will you attend the church dinner?" she asked. Howard shook his head. "I've been invited to the foreman's home. His wife insists no man should be alone at Christmas." Harriet felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "That's very kind of her." "You could join me," Howard suggested hesitantly. "Mrs. Campbell specifically mentioned you were welcome." The invitation touched Harriet deeply. It represented acceptance, not just of her presence in town, but of her connection to Howard, undefined though that relationship remained. "I'd be honored," she replied. Christmas with the Campbells proved to be a boisterous, warm affair. 4 children, ranging from 5 to 16, filled the modest home with energy and laughter. Mrs. Campbell, a capable woman with a ready smile, welcomed Harriet as if she were already family. "Howard speaks of you constantly," she confided as they prepared dinner together. "It's good to see him recovering his spirits after that terrible business with the rustlers." "He's very determined," Harriet observed, carefully avoiding any comment on their personal relationship. Mrs. Campbell studied her shrewdly. "That he is, but determination alone doesn't warm a man's heart. You've done that, whether you realize it or not." The Christmas feast was simple but abundant: roast goose, mashed potatoes, carrots glazed with honey, and apple pie for dessert. After the meal, the family gathered around the piano where the eldest Campbell daughter played carols while everyone sang. Harriet, whose expensive music lessons had trained her voice well, harmonized naturally with Howard's surprisingly rich baritone. As they walked back to the boarding house that evening, snow began to fall in large, gentle flakes. Howard offered Harriet his arm, and she took it, drawing closer to share his warmth. "Thank you for today," she said. "It was the nicest Christmas I can remember." Howard looked down at her, snowflakes catching on his eyelashes, even without fancy gifts and grand surroundings. "Perhaps because of their absence," Harriet admitted. "There was real joy in that home, not just display." They reached the boarding house steps, but neither moved to part. Howard turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight spilling from the windows. "Harriet, I know our arrangement was disrupted by circumstances, and I've tried to respect your need for time to reconsider. But I find myself growing more certain, not less, as the weeks pass." He took a deep breath. "I care for you deeply. More than I expected possible when we began our correspondence." Harriet felt her heart quicken. "Howard," he held up a hand. "Please let me finish. I'm not asking for promises tonight. I know I can't offer you the home or security you deserve yet. But I want you to know that rebuilding isn't just about recovering what was lost anymore. It's about creating something worthy of you, of us, if you'll eventually have me." The sincerity in his voice moved her profoundly. In Philadelphia, courtship had been a carefully choreographed dance of status and advantage. This was something entirely different: direct, honest, and founded on genuine feeling rather than social expectation. "I care for you too," she admitted softly. "More than I thought possible when I arrived to find an empty cabin instead of a home." Hope brightened his eyes. "Then you might consider when the time is right." "I might," she agreed. "In fact, I find myself considering it more often than not." Howard's smile could have melted the snow around them. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he leaned down and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief but sweet, a promise rather than a demand. "Merry Christmas, Harriet," he whispered. "Merry Christmas, Howard." As January's bitter cold gave way to February's unpredictable thaws and storms, life settled into a rhythm for Harriet. Her position at the boarding house expanded when Mrs. Bradley fell ill with winter fever, leaving Harriet to manage everything from meals to accounts for nearly 2 weeks. Her capable handling of the crisis earned Mrs. Bradley's genuine respect and a permanent increase in both responsibilities and wages. Howard, meanwhile, continued his punishing schedule at the mine while using every free moment to work on his property. Despite the cold, he managed to repair the cabin roof and reinforce its walls, making it at least weathertight if not yet comfortable. Their Saturday outings continued when weather permitted, evolving from formal visits to comfortable companionship. The tender kiss they'd shared at Christmas remained unrepeated but hung between them like a sweet promise. In late February, Howard arrived for their Saturday meeting with unusual excitement. "I've news," he announced as soon as they were seated in the hotel's small tea room. The bank has approved a loan smaller than I hoped, but enough to make a real start in spring. Harriet squeezed his hand across the table. Howard, that's wonderful. There's more, he continued. The railway's paying damages for cattle killed during the construction of the new spur line. Jenkins at the feed store mentioned his cousin lost 2 head and received $40 compensation. My cattle were taken by rustlers, not killed by the railway, but who's to say otherwise if no remains were found, Harriet completed, surprising herself with her ready acceptance of the deception. Howard looked slightly abashed. It's not entirely honest, but after what happened, it's justice of a sort, Harriet assured him. Will it be enough to rebuild properly? With the loan and the compensation, plus what I've saved from the mine, I can start on the house and replace half the herd by summer. His eyes met hers with quiet intensity. It won't be everything I promised in those letters, not immediately. But it will be a real beginning. Understanding dawned on Harriet. You're planning to leave the mine? Howard nodded. Come April. The foreman's already grumbling about it, but he understands. A man doesn't take to the mines except from necessity. And the house? Harriet asked, her heart suddenly beating faster. When would you begin? As soon as the ground thaws enough to dig foundations. I've redesigned it smaller to start, with room to expand later. 2 bedrooms instead of 3, but a proper kitchen and parlor as promised. He hesitated. I was hoping you might look at the plans, tell me if they suit you. The implicit question hung in the air between them. Harriet took a deep breath, knowing her response would set their course. I'd be honored to look at your plans, she said softly. After all, if it's to be my home too, I should have some say in its design. Howard's face transformed with joy. Does that mean? It means I'm ready to speak of our future together more directly, Harriet clarified. I came to Colorado as your promised bride. Circumstances interrupted that plan, but they haven't changed my willingness to consider a life with you. Consider, Howard echoed, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Harriet smiled. A lady must maintain some mystery, Mr. Kincaid. Show me these house plans. Continue your courtship through spring, and perhaps by the time the foundation is laid, you'll have your definitive answer. Howard laughed, the sound rich with relief and happiness. You drive a hard bargain, Miss Porter, but I find your terms acceptable. March roared in with slashing winds and freezing rain that turned to treacherous ice overnight. The harsh weather kept Howard and Harriet apart for 2 weekends, with only brief notes delivered by the grocer's boy maintaining their connection. When they finally met again in mid-March, Howard arrived with rolled papers under his arm and determination in his stride. The house plans, he explained, spreading them on Mrs. Bradley's dining table. Simple but solid. We can add to it as prosperity allows. Harriet studied the drawings, impressed by their practicality and attention to detail. The layout was efficient, with the kitchen positioned to catch morning light and the parlor windows placed to capture the mountain view. The bedrooms were modest but adequate, with clever built-in storage to maximize space. It's very thoughtfully designed, she said approvingly. Did you draw these yourself? Howard nodded. Architecture was a passion before ranching. I worked for a builder in Denver for a year when I first came west. You never mentioned that in your letters, Harriet observed. There's a great deal we have yet to learn about each other, Howard acknowledged. I hope we'll have a lifetime for such discoveries. The intimacy of his tone brought a flush to Harriet's cheeks. I've made some discoveries already, she said. For instance, I know you prefer coffee to tea, sunrise to sunset, and Shakespeare's histories to his comedies. Howard smiled. And I know you hum when you're concentrating, prefer lilacs to roses, and can recite Wordsworth from memory when you think no one's listening. Their eyes met in shared understanding of how their relationship had evolved from formal correspondence, genuine knowledge of each other. The contrast between the sanitized versions of themselves presented in their letters and the complex, flesh and blood reality had initially been jarring, but now seemed a blessing. They were building something real rather than idealized something that could weather Colorado's unpredictable climate and life's inevitable hardships. As March surrendered to April's tentative warmth, Howard left the mine as planned and threw himself into preparations for building. Harriet, whose capable management had made her indispensable to Mrs. Bradley, negotiated a reduced schedule that allowed her 2 full days weekly to assist Howard at the homestead. The foundation stones were laid in mid-April, a momentous occasion that drew several neighbors to help. The Campbells came, along with 2 other families whose ranches bordered Howard's land. Together, they positioned the heavy stones in the carefully dug trenches, cementing them with mortar Howard had prepared according to his builder's training. Harriet provided food for the workers, hearty stew and fresh bread she'd baked in Mrs. Bradley's oven before dawn. As she watched Howard directing the placement of each stone with meticulous care, she felt a surge of pride and certainty. This man, who had faced devastating setbacks with courage and determination, who worked himself to exhaustion without complaint, who treated her with unfailing respect and growing tenderness, this was a man she could build a life with. That evening, as the neighbors departed and the foundation stood complete in the setting sun, Harriet approached Howard where he stood contemplating his work. "It's a good beginning," she said softly. Howard turned to her, his face tired but triumphant. "Just a beginning. There's so much more to do." "We'll do it together," Harriet said, taking his hand in hers. "If your offer still stands." Howard's expression shifted from fatigue to dawning joy. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying yes, Howard Kincaid. Yes to being your wife, yes to building this home with you, yes to facing whatever comes together." Howard gathered her into his arms with a reverence that touched her deeply. "I don't deserve such faith after how things began." "Perhaps not," Harriet agreed with a smile. "But you've earned it since, 100 times over." Their kiss, framed by the setting sun and the foundation of their future home, sealed a promise born not of desperate necessity or convenient arrangement, but of genuine love that had grown in the most unlikely soil. They were married 2 weeks later in Golden's small church, with the entire town turning out for the occasion. Mrs. Bradley, now Harriet's staunch supporter, hosted the wedding breakfast at her boarding house. Mrs. Campbell provided flowers from her hothouse, and the mine foreman, still grumbling about losing his best worker, presented them with a fine clock for their future parlor. The wedding night was spent in the hotel's best room, a luxury Howard insisted upon despite its cost. His tenderness as a lover matched his consideration in all other matters, and Harriet discovered that physical love, approached with care and genuine affection, was a joy rather than the duty her mother had grimly described. The following morning, they traveled to their homestead not as visitor and host, but as husband and wife. The cabin, though still humble, had been transformed by Howard's recent efforts. The walls were freshly chinked against drafts, the floor scrubbed clean, and new glass installed in the formerly grimy windows. A proper bed with fresh linens replaced the narrow cot, and shelves held the few books and personal items Howard possessed. "It's still not what you deserve," he apologized as he carried her over the threshold, honoring tradition despite the cabin's temporary status. "But by autumn, God willing, we'll be in our real home. This is already more of a home than that empty shell I found last fall," Harriet assured him, kissing his worried brow. "Besides, It's not the structure that makes a home, it's the people within it. Construction on the main house progressed steadily through spring and summer. Howard's experience with building proved invaluable, allowing him to work efficiently and avoid costly mistakes. Harriet divided her time between helping at the homestead and continuing her work at the boarding house, saving every penny toward their future. By June, the frame of the house stood complete, a skeleton of promise against the Colorado sky. Howard worked from dawn until dusk, balancing construction with the demands of rebuilding his herd. The compensation money had purchased 8 good heifers to join his 2 survivors, and a neighbor's bull was borrowed for breeding. It wasn't the 40 head he'd once possessed, but it was a viable start. Harriet threw herself into creating a productive garden, determined to ensure they'd have food stored for winter regardless of other challenges. She planted potatoes, beans, corn, and squash in neat rows, tending them with the same careful attention Howard gave his building project. When Mrs. Campbell brought her 6 laying hens as a belated wedding gift, Harriet added a chicken coop to her domain, positioning it within sight of the kitchen window in their future home. July brought scorching heat that made construction work grueling, but allowed the roof to be completed before summer thunderstorms arrived. August saw the installation of windows and doors, transforming the structure from skeleton to shelter. By September, the interior walls were in place, defining the rooms that had existed only on paper months before. Through it all, Howard and Harriet's partnership deepened. The physical demands of frontier life left little energy for artifice or pretense. They saw each other at their most exhausted, most frustrated, and occasionally most desperate, like when a sudden hailstorm threatened the nearly completed roof, or when one of the new heifers sickened and nearly died. Yet these challenges, rather than straining their bond, strengthened it through shared purpose and mutual support. Harriet's Philadelphia friends would have been scandalized by her sun-browned skin and work-roughened hands. Her mother would have fainted at the sight of her daughter helping to raise roof beams or butchering chickens for the pot. But Harriet herself had never felt more alive or more purposeful. The direct connection between effort and outcome, the tangible results of each day's work, satisfied something in her that Philadelphia's ornamental existence never had. October brought the first light snows and a race against winter to complete the house's essential elements. The kitchen stove was installed first, allowing Harriet to cook proper meals rather than relying on the cabin's inadequate fireplace. Walls were insulated with layers of newspaper brought from town, then covered with simple pine boards that Howard promised would eventually be replaced with proper plaster and wallpaper. Next year became their shared refrain. Next year there would be curtains at the windows. Next year a proper sofa in the parlor. Next year perhaps a piano if the cattle sales proved profitable. On the first Sunday in November, exactly 1 year after Harriet had arrived in Golden to find an empty cabin instead of a home, they moved into their new house. It was still far from complete. The parlor lacked proper furnishings. The bedrooms needed wardrobes, and the promised second bedroom remained empty except for Howard's trunk and tools. But the kitchen gleamed with Harriet's careful arrangement of their modest collection of crockery and utensils. The master bedroom boasted a fine bed and washstand purchased from a family returning east, and the stone fireplace in the parlor drew perfectly, filling the house with warmth. That evening, after their first meal in their new home, Howard led Harriet to the parlor where a single chair, a beautiful rocking chair of polished oak, stood before the fire. "A house-warming gift," he explained as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood. "Campbell helped me with the turning, but the design is mine." Harriet sank into the chair, feeling it conform perfectly to her shape. "It's beautiful, Howard. But where will you sit?" He smiled and settled on the floor at her feet, leaning back against her knees. "Right here suits me fine for now." He took her hand, his expression growing serious. "Are you happy, Harriet? Truly, this isn't the life you were raised for." Harriet considered the question honestly. The past year had been harder than any in her previous existence, physically demanding, occasionally frightening, and initially disorienting. Yet it had also been richer, more authentic, and ultimately more satisfying than the constrained life she'd led in Philadelphia. "I'm happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "Not because everything is perfect, it's far from that, but because what we're building has real meaning. In Philadelphia, I was merely decorative. Here, I'm essential." Howard raised her hand to his lips. "You're certainly essential to me. Besides," she added with a smile, "we've only just begun. There's so much more to come." As if confirming her words, a fluttering movement within her abdomen reminded Harriet of the secret she'd been saving for this moment. She guided Howard's hand to rest against her still flat stomach, including a new family member come spring. Howard's expression transformed from confusion to wonder. "A baby, you're certain?" Harriet nodded. "Dr. Gardner confirmed it yesterday. He says all appears well." "A child," Howard whispered, eyes filled with awe. "Our child." He pressed his lips to her stomach in a gesture of such tender reverence that tears sprang to Harriet's eyes. "I hope he or she will be strong like their father," she said softly. Howard looked up at her with fierce determination. "They'll have everything we can give them, not just material things, but a home filled with love and purpose." "And stories," Harriet added, "about how their father promised a fine home through letters, then built it with his own hands when disaster struck. About how their mother traveled across a continent to find an empty cabin, but discovered something far more valuable instead." "What was that?" Howard asked, playing along. Harriet leaned down to kiss him gently. "The understanding that home isn't a place at all, it's the people who build it together. One stone, one board, one day at a time." As winter settled over the Colorado foothills, the Kincaid home stood solid against the wind and snow, not the grandest house in the territory, nor the most elegant, but one built with determination, skill, and love. Inside, a man who had lost everything but refused to surrender prepared a cradle for the child who would join them in spring. Beside him, a woman who had traveled west seeking security but found purpose instead rocked in her chair, planning the garden she would plant when the snows retreated. Together, they had transformed an empty cabin into something far more significant than either had originally envisioned, not just a house of wood and stone, but a true home built on the foundation of shared dreams and mutual respect. The journey had not been what either expected when they began their correspondence, but the destination proved infinitely more valuable for the challenges overcome along the way. By April, when their son Henry was born amid a glorious display of wildflowers carpeting the valley, the house boasted new curtains sewn during winter evenings, and a second rocking chair crafted to match the first. The cattle herd had grown to 15 with new calves, and the chicken flock provided eggs enough to sell the surplus in town. Howard had planted 10 apple saplings along the southern boundary, a legacy that would take years to mature but symbolized their commitment to the future. "He has your eyes," Howard whispered as he held his newborn son for the first time, wonder softening his weathered features. "And your determination," Harriet replied, watching how the tiny fingers gripped his father's calloused thumb. He refused to wait for the doctor to arrive. Indeed, Henry Kincaid had entered the world with characteristic impatience, arriving so quickly that only Mrs. Campbell, summoned from the neighboring ranch, had been present to assist. Dr. Gardner, arriving an hour later, had pronounced both mother and child exceptionally healthy despite the hurried circumstances. As spring blossomed into summer, the Kincaid homestead flourished along with its newest member. Henry grew strong on his mother's milk and his father's adoration. The garden Harriet had planted yielded abundantly. The cattle fattened on sweet grass, and Howard's careful management began showing proper returns. When autumn painted the aspen groves gold once more, they celebrated their first anniversary in the home Howard had built. The parlor now boasted a modest sofa purchased with the proceeds from Harriet's butter and egg sales, and colorful rag rugs softened the pine floors. The promised plaster walls remained a future project, but framed sketches Howard had drawn of the Philadelphia landmarks Harriet sometimes missed added warmth to the simple board walls. "It's still not everything I promised in those letters," Howard remarked as they sat before the fire, Henry sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby. Harriet shook her head, smiling at her husband's persistent concern. "It's far more, Howard. Those letters described a house and land. They couldn't possibly have promised what we've built together." Howard reached for her hand, his expression thoughtful. "When I wrote asking for a bride, I never imagined finding a true partner. I thought I needed someone to keep house while I built my ranch. Instead, I found someone who helps me build everything home, family, future. And I thought I needed security after my father's disgrace," Harriet admitted. "Instead, I found purpose and strength I never knew I possessed." She glanced at their sleeping son. "And love I never imagined possible." Howard drew her into his arms, his embrace as strong and steady as the home he'd built around them. "Not bad for a marriage that began with an empty cabin and a justifiably angry bride." "Not bad at all," Harriet agreed, resting her head against his shoulder and thinking how far they'd traveled from that first disappointing meeting. "Though I maintain that your apology was quite effective." Howard laughed softly. "Building a house seems an excessive way to say I'm sorry, but I'm glad it sufficed." "It wasn't the house, Howard," Harriet corrected gently. "It was watching you refuse to surrender when everything was lost. It was seeing you rebuild, not just the structures but the dream itself." She touched his face, tracing the lines that hard work and Colorado sun had etched there. "That's what I fell in love with, not your promises, but your determination to fulfill them despite everything." Their kiss, sweetened by shared memories and strengthened by shared struggles, sealed once more the promise they renewed each day through actions rather than words, the promise to build together, whatever the future might bring. A home worthy of the love that had transformed an empty cabin into the foundation of a rich and meaningful life.